You've hidden these things from the wise and the learned, but have revealed them to the little ones, to the merest children, another translation says. To grow and mature in the world often involves becoming more and more independent. That we grow up, when we're little, we're dependent on our parents for everything, to literally change our diapers, to feed us, to tend to our every need. But as we grow and mature in the world, we grow more and more independent. That we're able to fend for ourselves, take care of ourselves, go out in the world, and that's a good thing. That usually the one who's grows up and is still dependent on their parents for everything, we see as a lack of maturity. But maturity in the spiritual life, in some ways, is the inverse. As we grow and mature spiritually as Christians, it's not about becoming more and more independent, but in many ways growing more and more aware of my dependence upon God in every way, in every form, and leaning into that dependence, trusting in Him to attend our needs. And so that's why Jesus talks about how the kingdom of heaven belongs to little children. That to enter the kingdom of heaven, we must become more childlike. And in our gospel today, he says that these things are revealed to the merest children. It's not about growing more and more independent from God, but growth and maturity in the spiritual life is becoming more and more dependent on God. Aware of our dependence on Him and leaning into that. To more and more recognize that every aspect of who I am is sheer, total, undeserved gift from God. That I was once literally nothing, and God called me into being. And in that, then everything I am, the gifts I have, the capacities I have, all are from Him. And so, to recognize that all of my existence is dependent on Him, that I learn to lean into and trust that. In the past weeks, we've talked about some things that can hinder us from closeness to God. A few weeks back in June, talked about how sometimes our false sense of self and freedom and desires can be a hindrance to our relationship with God. But rather, it's when we surrender those things over to Him, when we trust in Him to care for myself, to fulfill my desires, to entrust my freedom to Him, that's where we find fullness of life. It's about coming to know Christ, not just about Him intellectually, but rather as a friend. Think of an innocent child who has no fear, who will just go and talk to a random person. That's the kind of boldness we're to approach Christ with, and to know Him as a friend, and to lean on Him in all things, to love Him above all things, as we heard last week, because loving Him, trusting in Him, leaning on Him in every way is the thing that orders everything else in our life. So let us become like little children. Because all of this is not merely about my own efforts in becoming holy, my own efforts to love, but rather God's work in me. This is part of what St. Paul is driving at in the second reading. Flesh versus spirit. Flesh is relying upon my own efforts, my own strength to make me holy. But rather, it's about allowing God's work in me, receiving that. So rather than in my own efforts and struggle to get to God, it's about letting God come and take care of me, allowing God to carry me, Rejoice, for your king comes to you, we hear. And all of this is primarily about God's work. God's work for us, God's work in us. We simply have to be like little children that come to him with our every need. But that means we do have the part of we have to turn to him. We have to invite him in, allow him in. That we have to show up to prayer. Because it's about being immersed in him. It's his work in us, but I have to put myself there. One image is like God is the great fire who wants to share his fire with us, but we have to go and put ourselves in the fire. And just like a log in the fire, if the log has to stay there to take the fire into itself, then you can pull it out of the fire and bring that fire to the world. However, if that log is out of the fire too long, it will lose the fire. So we simply have to immerse ourselves in God again and again, allowing him to fill us, to ignite us. I simply have to dwell in him. So to make that time for prayer. So as we trust in him like little children, I want to close with this quote about leaning on him, about becoming dependent on him. That this quote is a quote that is taped to my mirror that I pray at the end of the day. This is a quote from Edith Stein. It's all about turning everything over to him, trusting in him like little children, coming to him, as we also heard, all who are weary and are burdened, and we find rest in him. Because it's not about what I can do, but about allowing what he can do. And that's where I find peace. And so I'll close with this quote. And when night comes, and you look back over the day and see how fragmentary everything has been, and how much you planned that has gone undone, and all the reasons you have to be embarrassed and ashamed, just take everything exactly as it is, put it in God's hands, and leave it with him. Amen.